Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Coker-Hook, and this evening I'm very happy to have a returning guest to come and talk to us this evening, Mr. Kartik Gada, who is the Executive Director of Woodside Capital Partners, but more interestingly, the author of a work that he calls The Atom, and we'll define that in just a couple of minutes. But Kartik, welcome back to Reference Point. Thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for having me back.
Now, when you were here last time, I guess there have been a couple of things that have occurred. We'll tell the people all about the atom in a minute, but if I understood correctly, you now have a course coming up at Stanford in was it the winter semester or winter quarter here,
Winter
2018?
quarter.
Tell us about that.
So the course starts in the winter quarter, January 22nd. It's called The New Economics of Disruptive Technologies. And I will examine how each of these disruptive technologies, of which there may seem like there's too many to keep track of, artificial intelligence, fintech, blockchain, industrial IoT, 3D printing, quantum computing, AR, VR, and so forth, how they're disrupting traditional industries and the new business models that arise therein, and how this is one of the best times ever to be an entrepreneur because you can create something new and get a new business ramped up in a faster time than ever before and complete the entire cycle just in a more efficient and productive way. So it's a great time to be taking advantage of one or more of those technologies.
That sounds like it'll be a fantastic course. It would be kind of fun to sit in on that. But I'm guessing that you built a lot of this. As a matter of fact, you had mentioned this just before the show, that you'd built a lot of the information from this class out of your work with the atom. And I'm going to have the guys call up the first slide there because this has the information. The atom is actually, it's a contraction for the Accelerating TechnOnomic Medium, right?
Yes.
And so and this is the foundation for the course. So give us just a couple of minutes as background so that, you know, some of the folks who are watching may not have seen our first show. And then we want to dive into some of the new exciting stuff that we were talking about. So tell us a little bit about the atom.
So the rate of technological change is accelerating, as is somewhat more widely known, but that creates deflation because every technological disruption of an incumbent industry is of a deflationary nature, usually cost savings to the customers or productivity gains in the industry. That leads to a diffusion of this deflation across the economy. And the central banks of the world have been doing quantitative easing that has not caused the inflation that they and other economists expected. And I contend that it is merely offsetting this technological deflation. If this reality is recognized, that means a certain amount of money can be generated through QE without inflation, and that can be redeployed to much more productive uses and perhaps solve a lot of difficult problems that seem intractable for us today.
Cool. We'll get into that in a minute. I want to go into just a couple of things to make sure that I'm fully understanding, and also for the folks who are viewing. You mentioned, give us an example of a very specific technology or product or whatever where this deflationary impact has happened because of technological advancement.
So the technology that causes the purest type of deflation is usually artificial intelligence. It is the ultimate technology for those reasons. And just one example is how there are more and more artificial intelligence engines that can diagnose a person's illness more efficiently than any human doctor.
Right, like Watson.
Like Watson, and even ones that are more accessible than Watson that may even be available over the internet for subscription very soon. And not only does it get better and better as more people use it, as the nature of artificial intelligence, but the fact that the cost is so low and it can be accessed at any time, you don't have to go to the hospital and drive there, park your car, worry about the co-payment, wait in the waiting room for the doctor, everything. You can access it at home at 11 p.m. without any charge, potentially. And since it can take into account all of the findings of medicine, which no human doctor, no matter how smart, could ever do, like there's 20,000 medical journal papers every year. There's no doctor that reads more than 1% of those, but the AI can assimilate all of those. That can reduce the cost of many aspects of basic diagnosis and even more advanced diagnosis by 99%, maybe 99.9%. So 100x, 1000x savings. That's a huge saving across the entire healthcare system, which needs such a saving.
Absolutely. Okay. So thank you. I get the picture there. Now, the other thing that you mentioned that I want to get a little bit more perspective on was that as the governments had been using quantitative easing as a mechanism to try to stimulate the economy, they were looking, they didn't get the inflation that they were expecting. So what is the relevance of inflation in that context? We oftentimes think of inflation, you look at hyperinflation and things like that are going on in Venezuela or that happen in other places where every time you turn around, your money's worth less and less and less because of the inflationary thing. What is the value to the traditional economic model of inflation in this context?
So very high inflation can be a problem, but that has not happened in the United States or any advanced country since the 1970s. Deflation is much scarier for an economy like the United States today because everyone has so much debt. If you have mortgage debt, student loan debt, or even automobile debt, deflation is far more frightening than inflation because the payments stay the same while your income goes down. And low to moderate inflation, the best inflation rate may be 2 to 3%. That is far better than either zero inflation and certainly deflation, especially when your mortgage payment stays fixed and you expect your raises to increase so that the payment shrinks. Not long ago in the United States, you could expect your mortgage to be low by year 3 or 4, but now it's not until year 10 because the inflation is low, means raises are low, and it shrinks at a slower rate. That's the opposite direction of where we think technological progress should have taken us in terms of prosperity.
Okay, cool, got it, thank you. All right, so that's a little bit of a summary of what the atom is all about. Now, after you were here last time, which I guess was last May, you were getting ready to go to a conference in Brussels, an economic conference of some type, and you had the opportunity to speak at that conference, right? Tell us a little bit about that. What happened?
So that was a subcommittee at the European Parliament complex in Brussels, where I was there to advise on policy on self-driving cars in particular, but I had a chance to present the atom findings as well. Now, the officials of the European Commission, most of them did not necessarily understand it, but one or two did, and I got a couple of good contacts out of there. And I've been staying in touch with them because in Europe, one may think it is the hardest place to pass a notion that money printing can be good because in the past, money printing and high inflation has caused a number of terrible outcomes over there. But some people in the government are somewhat more receptive, and they are looking at these items a little bit more. I also spoke at the Shanghai AI Summit on July 6th, which was not a government conference as such, but there were some policy officials over there. They did not speak English, but I did have a translator, and they're also interested in some of these things, because in China they are, in fact, a little bit closer towards realizing these findings and implementing them.
Got it. Okay. So are the central banks, U.S., EU, Germany, France, whatever, are they still, Japan, are they still trying this quantitative easing concept?
Well, the strange thing is the U.S. has stopped quantitative easing and has started to reverse it, both by increasing the Fed funds rate and unwinding the Fed balance sheet, which they had built up during quantitative easing. But places like Japan and China are still doing quantitative easing of their own type more and more. So the two are canceling each other out in that Japan and China are just offsetting the reversal of quantitative easing that the U.S. is about to embark on. So the world as a whole is still doing $150 billion a month of quantitative easing, but that's lower than what it used to do. And that's much lower than what is needed to eventually keep up with technological disruption, which as of late 2017, I believe is at least $400 billion a month worldwide.
I'm not sure I totally got that. Let's $400 billion a month is what you're saying should be poured into the economy?
Should be poured into the
global economy in order to keep up with the technological deflationary
Yes, impact. And keep inflation at 2 to 3%.
2 to 3%, okay.
And they're reducing it and creating a gap that may be a problem in the near future.
Could you redefine for us all the term quantitative easing?
So, a central bank, when it creates money, it does not print money as such, but what it does is it buys existing securities, in the case of the United States, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, but only these two instruments, which is part of the problem. It bought a lot of these and would hold them for an extended period of time without selling them back, so that is effectively an injection of new money into the system until they slowly sell those back and reverse it.
Okay, thank you. So I had seen some things, and you and I had talked briefly about some things, because you mentioned that in Europe, in the EU, there may be a little more receptivity to certain things. It may be not quite as, and I had seen that, I think it was in Norway, that they were talking about using their sovereign fund to provide certain funds to every individual and whatever. This sounds a little bit like what the concept of the atom is, because when you talk about, and we should talk about that right now, when you look at what you believe is capable, is able to be done, if we were to adopt this perspective on the economics and infusion of money, that it should be possible through the growth of this technological advancement to be able to put funds directly to the individuals in any community. Is that?
Yes. So there are 3 European countries that have tried some version of this idea. They call it universal basic income. Now, Switzerland had a universal basic income. Finland did a pilot, and Norway, with their huge sovereign wealth fund, is also trying to do that. The problem is that in the case of Switzerland, they were paying for it through a tax increase, whereas I contend that the only sustainable form of a universal basic income is through a tax decrease, because you funded the government with the quantitative easing that one has to do anyway to offset the technological deflation.
Right.
And I provide the calculations for that.
Yeah.
And then it will work. So they're doing versions of it, but not quite the holistic picture of it.
Not quite as they could. And the thing about that's also interesting, because when people think about, oh, geez, if we were to send money directly to the individuals, this is not the way it's supposed to go, blah, blah, blah. But you were telling us from the last show, and I think slide number 2 talks about this, that the percentage of the U.S. federal outlay that goes directly to individuals anyway is pretty outstanding. It's huge.
It's
right?
huge. It is, as per the chart, 70% of all government spending is just a transfer between individuals in the form of things like Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, unemployment compensation, HUD, welfare, and things like that. And since we spend more than taxes collected, 70% of federal spending is really about 82 to 83% of taxes collected. So we have drifted in this direction over several decades, that the entire function of the federal government is just to transfer money. And in the process of doing that with these non-interlocking programs, there's 20 to 30% wastage, both in taxes collected due to the complexity of the tax code and compliance and auditing costs, and then disbursement through like fraud of Social Security and so on. And why have stigma on things like welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, things like that? Instead of doing 70% that way, you could just make small changes and make it universal, so it goes to everyone, whether you're rich or poor, and you're not wasting 40% of the money in just the collection and disbursement process. 40% of $4 trillion is a lot.
Yeah, right. And you wouldn't need the tax activity, because the government would be creating those funds out of the deliberately, as they're doing pretty much anyway, and then they're just disseminating it directly. Now, you were telling, one of the things we talked about last time was the positive impact that something like that has on the entrepreneurial environment. So give us a little bit more about that.
So under the set of ideas I've put forward, people would get a share of the quantitative easing. It starts out very small. As of late 2017, that's about $550 a month, but it was only $400 a month when I published the ad maybe 22 months ago. So $550 a month, that is tax-free. So the entrepreneur has a backstopped income that is independent of everything else, as do the employees he can attract, so more people can work at a speculative startup, number one. So the whole curve shifts in favor of entrepreneurship for that. Secondly, as income tax is phased out over a 10-year gradual process, the return on entrepreneurship is higher, because you're not going to pay a large portion, 40, 50, 55%, to the government after you took all the risk and succeeded as an entrepreneur. And that the current tax code is very, very anti-entrepreneur and very oppressive to the notion of entrepreneurship. I mean, I'm grateful anyone's still an entrepreneur at all when you think about it. But since all of this goes away, you would have far more entrepreneurship. More people will be able to pursue more specialized skill sets of what they can do. And just the range of activities in the economy will be a lot more, as well as you'd produce more technology, which causes more deflation, which enables more quantitative easing to be done, and that virtuous cycle continues.
You know, we had talked we keep talking about technology, and one of the things that's interesting about technology is the speed with which new technologies are embraced and become pervasive. And we have a slide number 4 up there that talks about the adoption rate of certain technologies, and it looks, and when you look at some of these curves, the way that this is played out, it starts like, it runs from 1900 to 2010, and you know, in the 1900s, in the 20th century, it looks like, you know, it was taken 30, 40, 50 years to get, or more, to get to even, you know, 50, 60, 80% adoption rate. And some of these new technologies are just like, they come out and within a couple of years, everybody's using it, right?
Absolutely. And this chart is a US only chart. I could not find a worldwide chart. If I could, it would look even more dramatic because the speed of diffusion is now so much faster that any major consumer product getting to 50% mass adoption happens very, very quickly. For example, Amazon Alexa is a very new thing.
Right, yeah.
But it's a huge number of units that have been sold already, you know, tens of millions of units. And just the mechanism of that diffusion is now so quick that everything stays more current in a more real-time manner.
So the various technologies bolster each other in their propagation, it sounds
yes.
like, right?
I contended that the atom, the Accelerating TechnOnomic Medium, is a broader medium of technology that is a certain component of the economy. It is not just rising to an ever-rising share of the economy. Right now it's 2% of world GDP, but rising quickly. But each technological disruption exerts a reinforcing force on every other technological disruption, and you can quantify the size of upcoming disruptions based on the dislocation from the trend line of each industry, and therefore kind of judge what portion of the accelerating TechnOnomic medium is being occupied by each disruption at every given time, and how much will be freed up when a certain disruption is completed.
You know, there are, and I think we understand, you know, certain things that we've seen that are technologies that are coming out. I mean, cell phones is one. You mentioned Alexa. We've got things like Nest, which is the you know, you can talk to your thermostat now and stuff like that. And all these things that are connected over the internet. You've got the refrigerators that'll actually have Wi-Fi connections and stuff like that. So we're seeing all of these sort of things, and it's just sort of like, okay, fine, we're adopting that. But there are things that are in the pipeline that actually haven't really hit yet, that are going to have additional impetus in this direction. Now, to what degree are these technological advancements and infusions immune to government intervention or suppression of getting it out there and stuff like that?
One thing that has always happened is that when any government has sought to block a certain technological disruption, that merely delayed it and then made the disruption more dramatic later on, because it still had to revert back to the trend line. The delay just caused a greater deviation from the trend line and therefore a sharper correction back to the trend line. There has never been an exception to that. The most notable is how OPEC tried to keep the prices of oil. So this is the governments of many countries. They held the world hostage for a long time, and they kept oil at $110 for several years until a technology to reduce oil prices became mature enough in the United States, and just 2 states within the United States, North Dakota and Texas. All they did was find a way to access oil they couldn't access before. It increased world supply by only 3%. 3% increase in world oil supply, and that was enough to make the price of oil fall by half.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so you can, it's going to happen no matter what, right?
And that was cool. OPEC in that case, the U.S. government trying to block something. In the other case, that hasn't really worked either. Taxis, for example, they went to their local governments for protectionism from Uber. That didn't work at all. The speed at which Uber displaced them and is so much cheaper and more reliable than them is really, their resistance delayed the disruption by very little time, and Uber is just so much more competitive that there's no way taxis can compete.
And now there's a bunch of them. There's Uber, there's Lyft, there's here in the Bay Area, there's Lyft and Chart, and then other countries they've got that kind of service, and there are which is great. Now, what about something that we're hearing a lot about just in the last few days because Bitcoin's been way in the news. But when you look at stuff and you're reading about things like Russia is coming out with its own cryptocurrency, and I think China was planning on doing the same, and other countries saying, oh, we ought to do this too, because I don't know whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but to what degree does that trend, that activity, how does that correlate to the atom?
So cryptocurrencies, the largest and first one being Bitcoin, are just a response to technology feeling that governments and nation states are stifling them. But it's kind of a small escape point from that broader thing. Bitcoin and the rapid price rise in Bitcoin is a response to that, and the creation of other cryptocurrencies. There are now 1,500 of them.
1,500?
1,500 of them. It's a very long tail. You know, most of those are less than 6 months old.
Oh, wow.
But those are all just escape points from governments not modernizing the monetary system fast enough. And these cryptocurrencies only happen because the holistic picture of the atom is not being addressed by governments. So they're kind of a workaround response to that, but only a very small escape valve from the broader problem.
So 1,500 was like, huh? That was a surprise. Now, one of the things about something like Bitcoin in particular is that it's global.
Yes.
I'm guessing that things like what the Russians are planning to do is it's localized. Is that a valuable thing? I mean,
It can be for some of them. This will force a reform into the monetary systems of the world government, just like Uber did with taxi medallions. It's somewhat analogous to that. But most of these 1,500 currencies will not succeed because only some of them are backed by real assets, some of them are well managed. A country that has certain dysfunction cannot simply escape that through a cryptocurrency because the same dysfunction will carry over to their management of that. And Bitcoin may not be the one that wins in the end because it's Bitcoin's infrastructure and the blockchain technology, or in other words, the security protocol generated from each Bitcoin, is very energy inefficient, and therefore it may not be the most competitive. It's just the first, so it's the most famous. It may not be the big one 10 years from now.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. When you say energy inefficient, what does that mean?
So to conduct a financial transaction on Bitcoin, or even on the blockchain generated through Bitcoin, that consumes 5,000 times as much energy as Visa or MasterCard's payment network.
Really?
Yeah. So they can only process a few thousand transactions a day, whereas Visa has to process billions a day.
Huh.
So it's not a direct competitor to those yet. Now, a different ledger, other than blockchain being a ledger that recorded the transactions and ownership, could come in that eventually achieves parity and even it may be better than Visa's network. But the currency on that may not be anything related to current Bitcoin or the number 2 Ethereum, which is more efficient than Bitcoin because it came later, but still much more power intensive than Visa.
And that's the interesting thing, things that come later. I mean, I look at it with respect to even what has happened globally when you have technologies like cellular technology, right? It came out first in the United States and we did whatever we did, but you go to certain countries that are considered, quote, third world countries, and they didn't have the telecommunications infrastructure that we did, that we had to deal with, and all that, expense and assets that were in play, and they leapfrogged in terms of their utilization and ability to take advantage of what the telecommunications today can do, which was, and that's I guess kind of an example of what we're talking about here, about how this technology just forces this ongoing change.
Yeah, this leapfrogging can be very, very dramatic in places. Like I can tell you, in India in the 1970s, if you wanted a landline phone, which was often unreliable, the wait list was 6 years or something like that.
Whoa.
The same was true in the Soviet Union. But they didn't have a huge copper wire network like the United States installed and had a good phone network by the standards of the time. But the United States sunk $300 billion into copper. A place like India doesn't have to do that because they go directly to cellular phones, so there isn't all this sunk cost into copper.
And now the majority of the population has cell phones.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left in the show today. I want to talk about, for the people who are watching, if they're understanding what we're talking about, how can they learn more about this? I think you have a website about it, but what if they're getting this and understanding it, what can they do to help foster the concepts and the adoption of this philosophy?
So there are a number of people who have to come together to make this reality. These are people in the technology industry, like luminaries in technology, economists, people in the media, and heads of state and other, parliamentary and governmental bodies. Of these four, the ones that are most likely to understand it well and bring visibility to it are the first group, the technology luminaries and the technology media. And I do what I can to make sure that these ideas are looked at by key journalists and some technology luminaries, but the more people kind of passing it along, the better. So if anyone is really interested in these ideas of quantitative easing being distributed to all people and phase out of all income tax, not just payment of tax, but filing and worrying about tax,
which would be wonderful.
This is the path towards that. And if you know anyone in the technology media, or if you know a technology big name luminary and you can get them to look at it, that is very, very valued.
I want to make sure the folks know that there is a website, and I think we've put the website information up there. But when you go up there, and I've done this, I've read through, the different sections of it, and there's graphs and all sorts of things, and it's really very enlightening. And if you do that, folks, you actually will get the specifics of the research and the supporting documentation and calculations that demonstrate why it is that this makes a lot of sense. So you ought to go and do that.
And there's a comment section there as well for people who have questions, which I'll address to the best of my ability.
There you go. There you go. Well, this has been really good. Congratulations on your upcoming class, and also on the opportunities that you mentioned in Brussels and in was it Singapore, Shanghai?
Yes, Shanghai.
Because I think that what you've got here is amazing, and which is one of the reasons I wanted you to come back and talk to us again, because I believe that people need to know about this. So Kartik, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, take a look at this. If you have some questions for us here, send them to info@referencepointtv.com, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.